The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hello, welcome to a discussion with Harry Crosby. I'm Tom O'Neill, and my guest today is Harry Crosby, author of the book A Wing and a Prayer. Harry, I was fascinated by your book. Would you please tell us a little of the background of the 100th Bomber Group and how it got its reputation as the Bloody 100?
All right. For better or worse, and justifiably or not, it was the hard luck outfit of World War II. Actually, our losses weren't much worse than any other group, but we lost them all at once. We had 8 really bad missions where we were almost completely wiped out. And so the 100th became part of the legendary as the Bloody 100th. It was so bad that when replacement crews were assigned to the 100th, they actually tried to get out because it was such a hard luck outfit. It was believed, I think incorrectly, I think it's been shown, that the 8th Air Force had a vendetta against us, and we're trying to, the Luftwaffe had a vendetta against us, and we're trying to get us out of the skies. So it was because of this that we were called the Bloody 100th.
Yeah, your book seems more realistic about World War II. It doesn't glorify it. Could you tell us a little about that?
Well, Tom, that's perceptive, I think, of you to notice, because that's one of the stories. Studs Terkel calls it the last good war. And what he means was it's a war that had a real enemy. Hitler was there, Toho was there, Mussolini was there, the Holocaust was there. We had to win the war. We were in it to helping the better guys. And war... This war had to be fought, but most of us sense that war is still bad. It's the ultimate failure, as far as I'm concerned, of human relationships. And so we were there, and we were doing what we should. We were so young. We were living way beyond our abilities. When I was 22 and 23, I was leading formations of 2,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters, and I don't even know anybody who's that young anymore. And here we were doing it. So on the one hand, we were doing in a great way what we should have done, but we knew the job itself was wrong. It's not right to just blow a city off the map. So that's the ambivalence of the war, which I think is the story.
Okay, what was the size of the 100th?
Well, the 100th, when we put a group of planes up, we put up a group which would be 21 aircraft. So the group was, as we flew, would be 21 aircraft and 21 crews. But all told, we were a city. The story was it took 7 people on the ground to keep 1 person in the air. So we were a village. There were about 3,500 of us, and the turnover was such that all told about 7,000 people served in the 100th. But whenever I'm speaking of a group, I'm usually speaking of the fighting formation, which would be 21 planes in the air.
Okay, the group lost 86% of its original fighters. And how many missions did you fly?
Well, I got credit for 37 missions because I started out to fly 25, and then as the war got easier and I didn't finish up, they kept stretching it out. So, but the casualties are right. I went overseas in May of 1943, May 31st, 1943, with 35 crews. So on each crew would have 4 officers: a pilot, co-pilot, navigator, and bombardier. And 3.5 months later, of the 140, there were 3 of us left. So it was not habit forming. I'm telling you, some of those were prisoners of war. Some of them had been injured and were in hospital someplace. But there were only 3 people operational. So the casualties were absolutely horrendous, and they hurt too. You saw your friends get shot down. You'd come back to your barracks at night, and 12 beds would be empty. And so it was not a pleasant experience at all.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine the amount of planes you went through with the damage and the accidents.
That's right.
Shot down.
And the sheer enormity of it. I think they talk about the Armada, and the British still speak about the skies being darkened by the 8th Air Force. But we sometimes flew missions where what we call the maximum effort, and we'd have 2,000 bombers. That'd be 75 groups, all in a long strung-out formation, and we'd have 2,000 bombers and 1,000 fighters. So they were big operations and absolutely devastating strike forces.
Yeah, I find it amazing that the B-17 could take the damage it did and still get the crew back.
Yeah, well, that's probably why the B-17 was loved the way it was. A decent B-17 crewman never speaks harshly of a B-24, but they flew faster, they had bigger, the Liberator had bigger bomb loads and so on. So in that sense, they were maybe better than the B-17. But the B-17, you could knock 3 engines off, knock half the tail off and half of one wing, and they'd still get home. We loved the B-17.
Yeah, the landing you made in the Soviet Union after the bombing run, I find that it's just a unique experience. Would you tell us about that?
Yes, it was a big operation to fulfill a political need. Stalin wanted evidence that we were in the war, and so we had what we called a shuttle. We went to bomb a place near Berlin, chosen because it wasn't supposed to be so dangerous, so we'd all get there. And when we got there, I think on this one, there were about 120 planes, about 4 groups, as I remember, 5, 6.5 groups on. And when we got there, we realized that it was not well coordinated because there was no aerial or no ground-to-air defense. And so we landed on these makeshift runways and all, and then we looked up, and there were these kind of Stuka observation plane flying, just droning around, and nothing to shoot at it. And my commanding officer, a very great leader named Tom Jeffrey, said, "Look, we're sitting ducks. We're going to get out of here." So without any orders or any approval, we took off and flew on the deck. And this, of course, was horrible for me because I was always airsick. And anytime we were, I was always airsick, even at 5 miles in the air. But anytime when we were bouncing around on the deck, I really got airsick. And so I think more about how sick I was in Russia than how much I accomplished. But we got our planes and 2 or 3 other groups off, and the groups which were left on the ground were bombed that night. They just droned and dropped a bomb and droned around and dropped a bomb, and they destroyed 73 aircraft. That's the worst loss of any aircraft task force ever. And so the rest of us had to, when we flew back, we were at half strength.
Yeah. Yeah, you flew on the longest missions that they flew from England, to Trondheim,
That's correct.
in Norway, and Regensburg, and then to North Africa. What special problems for the navigator did that present?
Well, it differed as time passed, and I did. That's maybe my major claim to fame, was that I was the only member of the 1,100,000 people who served with the 8th Air Force who flew on those long missions. And the first one, the Trondheim mission was bad because I was very badly trained. I was not prepared to do it. I didn't even belong on the crew that was leading, and we didn't have good maps, and we just didn't know what we were supposed to do. So that was, and I was flying the only navigator in the lead, whereas later we ended up with a so-called Mickey operator running the blind bombing apparatus, and then also a crew navigator, and then so-called command navigator. But I did it all by myself. So that was tough. And then the one to Regensburg was not so bad for me because I was tail end Charlie, and I just followed everybody. It was bad because we got hit, but because that was the day that the Germans were coming in from the tail, and they just wiped us out. And but the main thing was, I suppose, was overcast. Just so much of the time we just couldn't see the ground, and we didn't do celestial. We didn't have any kind of electronic navigation. So the demands were beyond us. People comment when they read the book how I don't mention being frightened. Well, I wasn't frightened because my responsibility was so great. If I was 2 miles off, we might go over some flak and some of my friends would be killed. Or if I missed a rendezvous with fighters early on by 4 minutes, they could only be with us 8 minutes. So for 4 minutes we'd have escort, and then they would leave and go home and wave, and we would be at the mercy of the Luftwaffe. So my fear was that I couldn't navigate as well as I should be, rather than the fear of getting shot down.
Yeah.
The navigation was tough. And I like to think that that's maybe what the story is. In effect, we went from the Hollywood flyboy with the white scars to war with the radar screen, and the navigator became more proficient and more important as time passed.
Yeah, your book makes clear how the 100th kind of evolved. I don't know if it's into a more professional or more, tight flying, tight formations. Was that typical of the whole Air Force?
Not so much. But again, you're very perceptive in seeing what's happened. The 100th in particular was notorious for its flyboy, raunchy image. We had practice missions where only half of the people would get there because all the rest of the pilots happened to lose an engine near the hometown of their girlfriend and so on. And we were the 100th. We were raunchy, and we made raunch to a fine art. And our leaders wanted to be Hollywood types, and they wanted to fly pea shooters, they called fighters in those days. So maybe the 100th was a little bit worse, but the mechanization of it and the science of it increased as we went by, as time passed. As we saw that a romantic kind of flyboy flying that B-17 all by himself was not what was going to win the war. So teamwork and training, and I suppose Curtis LeMay gets about as much credit because he realized how it had to be done and how important formation was, how important the training of lead crews was.
And General LeMay mentions you as one of the outstanding officers who's ever served with him.
That was a surprise because certainly on 3 occasions, I thought I displeased him plenty. I just thought he couldn't tolerate me. But then at the end of the war, when he listed me as one of the 35 outstanding officers who served him, I was delighted. And then he also sent me a picture of himself, and I couldn't believe it because I was so much, I thought, the wrong type for his Air Force.
Yeah, I always think of flying as a fairly comfortable experience. Would you tell us what flying in a B-17 was like?
Well, it was different from everybody else because I was airsick all the time, and it was a lot better to fly in a B-17 than some of the other aircraft because it was a very airworthy plane. They talk about the air being like the sea, being terribly unforgiving, but you could really beat up on a B-17 and it would come home. And it was good for bombing. Everything was good about it. That was, I think, why they loved the B-17 rather than just thinking of it as a pile of nuts and bolts. But it was the main thing was its absolute dependability. You more times than not, you'd come home with a missing engine, or more times you could look back at your group, or if you're on the ground, the number of times that they were shooting red flares, which means let me land first, I've got wounded aboard. And we saw a lot of red flares, but we were still grateful to the B-17, the Flying Fortress, because it was so airworthy.
Okay. How long did the research for this book take?
It took my life. Because people ask me why I waited so long, because I had this story in my mind, and as I was writing it, I just couldn't believe the detail that would flood back. It was just there to be written. And when I would compare my story with when people remembered it, it's not in the book, but at one time it was necessary to describe what happened in a poker game where they were playing for a big pot, and 50 years after the poker game, the person who held the hand and I who watched it remembered 10 cards, and we agreed on 9 of the cards. So the memories are there, but because I had flown it, because I had been there so long, people just always assumed that I would write the story. And when I finally did write it, I got a wonderful review from somebody who never had yet read the book. But he said, well, the 100th story has to be told, and it's finally going to be told, and it'll be a great story. But I wrote it very rapidly. I wrote it in 9 months. I write fast, but I was writing it out of my memories, and then I'm the editor of the newsletter, and I've been the editor for 23 years. So bits and pieces of the stories and the anecdotes which involved other people had been retold. So technically, I did not research it. It's a memoirs. And I've been intimidated a little bit about what if somebody catches me in some really serious exaggeration, but so far they've been very supportive.
Okay.
So,
I remember several of the stories in the book. One was the liquor run to London. Would you tell us about that?
Oh, one of the messages is that it wasn't only dangerous when we were getting shot at by the flak or the Luftwaffe. For the first 2 months, we lost more men to bicycle accidents and taxi accidents than we did with the Luftwaffe. And we had all kinds of landing and takeoff accidents, but this one I wanted to show that even the practice missions were dangerous. In fact, on 2 practice missions we actually lost planes when the Luftwaffe would come suddenly surprise us. But in the case of the liquor run, we were sent to London to get liquor for our 200th birthday party, our anniversary, our 200th mission party. And when we started to take off, Cowboy Roan, and people are always amused at how many of the names are nicknames, and Cowboy Roan and Hong Kong Wilson and all of that. But when we started to take off, we were missing an engine, and so they fiddled around, tried to get the engine. Then they tried to taxi fast down the runway and make the propeller go around and start, and they couldn't get it. And so finally, we took off with 3 engines, which you weren't supposed to do. And so that was called emergency procedure. And as we were doing it, we had to, as we broke out of the pattern, the crew chief was supposed to fire a flare to saying that we were leaving the pattern. Well, he pulled the pistol down, and instead of the flares going out into the air, they went into another box of flares. So all the flares caught on fire, and so here we were in a B-17, which is just a volatile mix of gasoline fumes, and these bombs were going everywhere. And it was 4th of July writ large right in the plane, and these Roman candles were coming off in the nose and all, and they try, and so so here they are missing an engine and with all these fires and so on, and we went over St. Paul's Cathedral about 200 feet, and we finally got everything straightened out. And then after when we got down, the group surgeon happened to be there, and he said, "Thank you for giving us a nice tour of London." He had no idea how nearly he was to the end of it. Yeah.
How accurate are the movies, such as the recent ones, Memphis Belle?
Memphis Belle. They're as accurate as you can make them. 12 O'Clock High was superb. It was that was the way it was. In the case of Memphis Belle, everything that happened to the Memphis Belle on that mission happened, but it didn't. It rarely happened to one crew on one mission, so they compacted it at a lot. The parts that were condemned were actually true. For instance, when the pilot goes out and talks to the plane, well, that was considered maudlin and sentimental, and they said, surely nobody will do it. That happened. We loved the B-17. We gave it intimate names, girls' names, and the love of it. So I found it quite dependable. I don't know of any bad movies about World War II. That is about the Air Force. That's the one part that I know. I found them amazingly representation. Of course, the original Memphis Belle is superb. That is the documentary.
Yeah, Memphis Belle is part of the Confederate Air Force now, isn't it, that plane?
Actually, that name has been bandied around. The plane that flew in the movie as Memphis Belle is the plane of a friend of mine, and I've flown in it a number of times. There's a fellow named Dave Talashe who owns 75 restaurants, and he was a co-pilot in our bomb group. And they're given Air Force names, like the 100th Bomb Group, the 95th Bomb Group, and the like. And so that plane changed its name from Sentimental Journey to Memphis Belle. And the Confederate Air Force, knowing that that was a good name, changed one of its planes' names to Memphis Belle. I think Memphis Belle is in a museum someplace, the real one.
Yeah, you mentioned 12 O'Clock High in your book. That was patterned after the 100th?
Several groups make this claim, but Bernie Lay flew with us on one of the missions, which is in the book, and wrote about it for I saw Regensburg fall, as I remember, and that was in the Saturday Evening Post, and he mentions the 100th, and the fact that we need to have a group commander depose and relieve his command. Plenty of Bernie Lay's story is about the 100th. I'm sure a lot of it's fictitious and a lot of it's from other groups. But certainly the 100th, the Bloody 100th, is heavily related to Bernie Lay's excellent, I think, novel and fine movie. Gregory Peck thinks of himself as a kind of an honorary member of the 100th, and when we have our reunions, on several occasions he's written nice letters to us about our reunion, wishing us well.
Yeah, you have annual reunions then? Is that
they're semi-annual, so if that's the correct term. Every other year we have them. And here again, the Bloody 100th's notoriety contributes to this comradeship we have, in that the average reunion maybe brings back 200 people. Some of them are only 75, and some of them are 500. But the 100th has infinitely more than us. But we have 1,000 people come back to our reunions. We have them every year. The one this fall in October is at Little Rock. But they're wonderful things. They get together. We don't require much programming because it's good to talk.
Yeah, you mentioned a lot of times on pass, even the fact that you're a member of the 100th was...
Oh, yeah. Even now, when it develops that I'm in the 100th, I'll run into somebody and I'll say, oh, I'm glad to meet somebody who flew in the 8th Air Force, and he'll say, well, I'm glad that I meet somebody from the 100th who's alive. Because they assume that we all got shot down, and whenever our young crews our replacement crews, I should say, would go to London and they said, what group did you sign to? They'd say the 100th. Oh, poor guy. And we had placement crews attached to the 100th who absolutely refused to fly with the 100th. And I didn't know this story myself, but when I was in Dayton a short time ago, somebody came up and said, well, here's a story about the 100th, that what didn't happen in the 100th. And we were at reduced strength so many times that we couldn't put up a whole group, and they formed what they call a composite group. That is, a flight would fill in from the 390th or the 95th or some other group. And whenever this would happen, the pilots would have to tell their gunners that they were going to be flying with the 100th, against whom the Luftwaffe was supposed to be having a vendetta, and certainly our losses were terrific, and certainly we were hard luck. And so occasionally the pilot wouldn't tell his gunners that we're going to be flying the 100th. But this fellow in Dayton told me, he says, I swear it's true, that I didn't tell my gunners that we were in the composite group with the 100th. And when we brought our plane up to the square D of the 100th, one of our crew got on his parachute and said, I'd rather jump out over England than get shot down over Germany, and he went out. And the guy swore that this was the truth. But this is what the reputation of the 100th was. In one case, early on, we had a few B-24 outfits in our division, and that was hard because they flew faster than we did and had bigger loads and so on. So they converted the 24s over to B-17s. Well, their tail insignia had been a circle O. The triangle was the first division, the circle was the second, which is 24s, and we were the square. So all of a sudden they realized that they were going to be square O, and that looked too much like the square D. So they insisted that they be changed to something else because they might look like us and get the attack that we always got. So they changed it to square W because W was the only only letter in the alphabet that they still had available. So that was what the reputation was like, and it was odd. It was ambiguous. You were frightened and concerned about it, and you hated to lose your friends. But it was kind of great to be a member of the Bloody 100th, and because you'd walk into a bar and immediately people would buy you drinks, and the girls loved the Bloody 100. So it was a mixed feeling.
The other story I found particularly amusing was the navigator that evidently one of the crews wanted to get rid of. Would you tell us that story?
Well, I'll tell it, and as you may have noticed, I faked the name.
Yes.
Because when it happened, it seemed okay. It seemed funny, and I noticed that I laughed at this story, and I thought it was for the good. But in one of the many times when we lost our commander, either because he was shot down or because he was relieved in command, we got a fine new group commander named Thomas Jeffrey. He was a lieutenant colonel, then he became a full colonel, and then he eventually had 2 stars in the military as a major general. But he had heard that the 100 was a group of raunchy types and undisciplined, so he brought in 22 captains and majors, all set to take over the jobs of the high-ranking people. And in fact, somebody took over the group bombardier's job, and somebody took over the air exec's job, and somebody took over the S2, that's intelligence.
Yes.
And I thought this was great because now I could go home, and I'm afraid I'll misspeak and actually speak his name, because I resolved that anybody who was treated badly, I would not use their names, and because those people since the war have done well and been fine. But the guy, I'll call him, the guy who was to take over my job, immediately started wanting to run everything, and which was fine. I was ready for that. But he was put on a mission, and when he came back, the crew was wild because all during the time he kept saying bogey, bogey, bogey at 12 o'clock, and they'd look out and there wouldn't be any. The guy was around the bend. Not only that, he wanted to be a hero and he wanted to do something. And when they got on the bomb run, he suddenly threw in a heading that was wrong, and they flew away from the target and missed the target. The pilot said, "I'll never fly with him again," and the navigator wanted to bring what we call charges against him. And so here I had this moral dilemma. On the one hand, if he took over, I could go home. I hadn't been with my young wife for a long time. I had been around longer than anybody else. I wanted to go home. But leaving him in charge, I didn't know what to do. And so I went on pass, and I didn't have to make the decision. And when I came back, the guy was gone. And I said, "What happened to him?" And my assistant said, "Don't ask." But I did ask. I asked the pilot, and he wouldn't tell me. And finally, I got the co-pilot. And what they did, they knew they did not want him to be the group bombardier, so they set it up so when they went over the target, they were hit, as we were always hit.
Yeah.
And the pilot, Bill Murray, made the plane shake, and he said, "We're in trouble. We're going to trouble. When I hit the bell, everybody out," and the emergency bell. So he hit the bell, and the only person who went out was the guy. And so down he went because everybody else was in on the joke. So when I came back, well, the problem was solved, and I was the group navigator for the rest of the war. But I should have been horrified. What was it? The guy became a POW and everything was fine. But I should have felt horrified, but I felt relieved. So the story was funny, and I laughed, and it's still a story that's told. But that's the way we became when at 22 we were becoming people who were destroying cities. It was a very ambivalent feeling.
Yeah, the other part I remember with some interest is the trip you made to Paris and the job you turned down. Would you tell us about that too?
I turned the job down, but I didn't specifically say I could have had it because Colonel Spatz or General Spatz didn't say, "Look, Crosby, we want you here." I probably could have got it because I fulfilled the specs that they had for it. But after I was more or less through with my tour, and because because of the changes, I wouldn't have got to go home. I was either supposed to fly another tour or take a job in the theater. And Tom Jeffrey who had now finished his tour and was working at Paris headquarters of USTAF or ATO headquarters, said, "Come on, there's a wonderful job for you." So I went over to become the staff navigator for General Spatz. I would have made at least full colonel on it, and I would have got to work with all the dignitaries and the big people. But when I got over there, it was hard for me to feel that you could fight a war in Class A's with your shoes shined and have absolutely stunning French woman to be your chambermaid and so on, and have all these wonderful, wonderful whacks as your master sergeants and so on. But I'm not I wasn't that kind of a person. I thought I could do my job on the very level of where the fight was, but to tell somebody how a B-24 should fight or how a Messer how do you handle it, I didn't know that I had that kind of work, so I did not take the job.
Okay, well, I think our time is about up. I want to thank you, Harry Crosby, for being with us today, and I want to thank you for joining us on a discussion with Harry Crosby and his book, A Wing and a Prayer. Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.